So let's talk about our first D, dependence. Basement dweller, you cannot kill what already has no life. Is marijuana addictive? Nick's going to talk a little bit about this, but let me just say there's a withdrawal syndrome. It's not as rewarding if you give it to rats as cocaine, heroin, or amphetamine, but animals will self-administer THC, which is kind of a test for does something tweak the reward circuitry. And it's pretty clear that the rewarding effects of THC are mediated by dopamine in the mesolimbic system. Now, I don't want to snow anybody with science talk, but that's the part that sex, drug, and rock and roll tickle, right? Dopamine in the mesolimbic system. So it's pretty clear that marijuana, this drug, has the capacity to be addictive. There's a withdrawal syndrome that I'm going to let Nick talk about. And what we find, this is a 2014 study, that if somebody has marijuana withdrawal, this is 127 adolescents who reported cannabis as their drug of choice. And some had withdrawal symptoms and some didn't. And let me just summarize what it said. Adolescents who reported withdrawal were more likely to meet cannabis dependence, had higher substance abuse severity, more consequences. So if you have marijuana withdrawal, you're more addicted, you're sicker, and so we should treat that. That's a summary for the study. But if you look at the rates of dependent or abuse of marijuana compared to other drugs, 2010, marijuana is just far and away the most common. 9%, say 10 if you want to lump it, become dependent, people who use it. 1 to 6 who start in adolescence. So starting in adolescence is a worse deal. I'm going to say this a bunch of times and you're going to walk out remembering, don't start in adolescence because your brain is just, and then 25 to 50% of people who use daily develop dependence. And this is restating percent who become addicted. So, the 30% of people who use tobacco wind up becoming addicted. And heroin, unsurprisingly, if you use it, your chance of becoming addicted are pretty high. Marijuana is not the highest, but it's not zero. About 10% of people who use marijuana wind up becoming dependent. And marijuana craving, we've imaged this in the brain. It's pretty clear that if you take regular users, you keep them off for 3 days and you give them cues, that the brain areas will light up that stimulate this craving. So all of this just evidence that there's a marijuana dependence syndrome. Cannabis withdrawal is real, and I'm going to save that for Nick. Let me switch to my second D, which is driving. So I haven't seen this in the papers much. I don't read the papers much, but I haven't seen in the papers the kind of outburst of concern about marijuana, drugged driving. But I'm going to show you one slide to make the point that driving stoned is as dangerous as driving drunk. It really is. And sadly, if you have a beer and a joint, they're additive unsurprisingly. That's what, okay, so I don't know if this person was stoned, I doubt it. But 60% fail a field sobriety test 2.5 hours after moderate use. That's old data. Marijuana appears in your system 3 to 5 times more frequently in fatal driving accidents. And driving simulation performance and THC levels vary. Risk of an accident doubles when someone drives after using marijuana. This is really the important data, along with the fact that, and this is just to give you some kind of sense of it, people who smoke and drink low-dose marijuana plus low-dose alcohol brings your blood alcohol up to 0.9, so it about doubles it. So if teens are going out smoking a little and drinking a little, not really drunk and not really stoned, but you get an additive impairment. That's, I guess, unsurprising, but it's another concern. This is the most important part of the presentation in terms of risks. We all know that marijuana is addictive, and we all know I don't want to be next to, I'm in the parking lot at Vaughn's, and it just smells terribly of marijuana. And I'm like, let's get out of here, kids. I don't want to be with that guy when he pulls out. But the underachievement data is really scary and striking, so I really want to emphasize this. Numerous people in different parts of the country have taken cohorts and studied them, and shown that the trajectories really differ from the marijuana users and not. And they differ in a lot of areas, not just learning. So this is where the fog metaphor comes in. So look at some of this data for a minute. But first, underachievement. The tallest blade of grass is the first to be cut by the lawnmower. How about this? Because soaring with the eagles requires so much more effort. I think these were written by somebody who may have been stoned. So part of what my fear for the future is that a lot of teenagers are going to wind up with their head stuck in pot. Remember, I love this term. I still remember it from medical school, amotivational syndrome. Everybody remember this term back in the 80s? So this is not new. Psychiatrists and psychologists said, so they said that regular marijuana use causes more password, inward turning personality characteristics, a state of relaxed and careless drifting, and that these folks demonstrate a strong tendency toward regressive, childlike, and magical thinking. That was in the 80s. Here's a couple of studies, and then we'll get into the big ones. This was a study of 65 heavy users and 65 light users. They make them quit marijuana for 24 hours because they're going to take their SAT. And what they showed, heavy users unsurprisingly displayed greater impairment than light users on attention and executive function. This is what helps you do well in school and life, even after a day of abstinence. So the drug is out of your system, you're still impaired. That's why I tell parents, if their kids are smoking in college all the time, I mean, I would have a talk about who's covering tuition, right? It also brings to mind a quote from a patient of mine who wanted me to treat his ADHD, and he said, I asked him why his Adderall dose is so high, and he said, I can't stay awake when I'm baked if I don't take this much Adderall, right? No, you guys laugh, but actually, how many clinicians do you think prescribe and don't do drug screens? Right? So how much are we treating marijuana impaired executive function with marijuana? My personal rule, I try to stick to it, is if you've got pot in your system, I'm not going to give you a stimulant. It just doesn't, we're working against each other. It just doesn't make sense. To examine the effects, here's another study. It's a retrospective study, 120 near daily users and 33 controls, so they compare them to other people. Long-term cannabis users performed less well on impaired learning, retention, retrieval, and the heavy cannabis users more of the same. Everybody's aware of this. Okay. Anybody know the marshmallow test? Self-control? Yeah? If you haven't heard of it, it's great research by Walter Mischel. You put a plate with the marshmallow in front of a kid, age 5 or so, and you tell them if you just can wait, then you can get 2 later. And then they ring the bell if they can't wait. And what they showed, it's fascinating, is that outcomes in life, 10, 20, was it 30 years out? I mean, a long ways out. They could correlate a kid's, how well he does in life with how much self-control he had with the marshmallow. And these videos are hilarious. Okay? So this is marijuana and dropping out of school. This is comparing people who initiated marijuana before they dropped out and did not initiate before they dropped out. Marijuana is associated with, early marijuana use is associated with an increased likelihood of dropping out of school. Here's a study, 1,200 people. The more marijuana you use, so I can say occasionally, frequently, really frequently, increasing levels of marijuana, ages 14 to 21, were associated with lower degree attainment, income, welfare dependence, unemployment, lower relationship satisfaction, lower life satisfaction. So across the board outcomes. And you see this in all of these different large long-term studies. How many occasions did you use cannabis between ages of 14 to 21? Blue is I used it a lot. This is your chance of being on welfare, of being unemployed, of gaining a university degree, very low. Income is kind of in the middle. But these significant life outcomes at age 21 to 25 are correlated with how much marijuana you use. This is underachievement again. There's more. It just keeps coming. I'm just going to overwhelm you. This is a study from Australia, New Zealand. 2,000 people in this study. Association between the maximum marijuana frequency at age 17 and outcomes up to 30. So remember, I interview you here and here and here and here, and I ask you all these questions. We recorded, the researcher said, clear and consistent associations and dose response between frequency of use and bad outcomes. So one of the ways we know things cause something is if I give you a little bit of poison ivy, you get a little rash. If I give you a lot, you get a bigger rash. And if I rub it all over your body, you have to stay home. So one of the ways we know marijuana causes underachievement is if you use a little, you're a little less. If you use more, then you're even more less. And if you use a lot, then you're really down. So it's pretty clear that something's causing this, and that there's what's called a dose response curve. So this is fun. Remember, this is a different study, folks. Chances of getting a high school degree or completing high school goes down by about 1/3 if you're frequently using marijuana. Cannabis addiction goes up by 20 times. Use of illicit drugs is higher, and suicide attempts is higher. Here's a researcher saying prevention or delay of cannabis use in adolescence We'll have broad social benefits. You see that word adolescence again. If we can prevent people from using this until their brains are mature, that's better. Another study in Puerto Rico, 800 people, 5 waves of interviews. I'm showing you that this isn't just one study in one place. This is a lot of studies all over. And so you take people who use none or low frequency, and then you see the higher and the higher and the higher. This is, again, 800 people from a different area, different race, African Americans and Puerto Ricans. How much marijuana people used? In this study, they studied work commitment, financial stability, victimization, and peer drug associations. Those were the outcomes they used. And they showed, unsurprisingly, that the more you use, the worse outcomes you had. And they suggested the treatment should be focused on the chronic, people who are using chronically and people whose use are increasing. Those are the at-risk groups. This group said, treating marijuana in late adolescence may serve to reduce the likelihood of becoming a marijuana-dependent adult who has difficulty functioning in the world of work and the social environment. Okay, this is our mantra about treating people early if we can. Chronic marijuana should be treated as an important public health problem. Last study, but again, these are large studies. This is probably the best. It's a prospective study, so I start here before people start using, and I measure multiple outcomes, relationships, intelligence, other things. And one of the criticisms of research is, okay, so you say marijuana, let's say I'm a member of NORML. Of course, I wouldn't be up at this point, but that's neither here nor there. Is NORML still around? Yes. Okay, so let's say I'm a member of NORML, and I'm a scientist. Because I would say, well, actually, all you're showing is that marijuana, people who drop out of school don't do well, right? If you drop out of school, you're not going to do well. That's really the association. So they sorted out people who stayed in school and smoked a lot from people who dropped, so they took that factor out. Then they asked third parties. They asked you, hey, how's Jim doing in life? How's he, right? So they get observers, really a lot of robust outcomes. And then they showed that if you did it for 10 years and then kept going, that there were still impairments, although they lessened if you stopped. So really good data of causality. Here's what they said. Collectively, and this was several thousand people, these findings are consistent with speculation that cannabis use in adolescence, when the brain is undergoing critical development, may have neurotoxic effects. There's good data for that. This is the famous IQ drop study. Everybody hear this one? Drops your IQ 10 points. It's been criticized. If you have infrequent use of cannabis at age 38, the difference between your teen IQ and your adult IQ is not significant. But if you have frequent cannabis use, the difference between your teen IQ and your adult IQ is significant. They said about 10 points of IQ difference if you use cannabis heavily. Now again, this study has been questioned because they didn't control, but there's reasonable data that this takes the edge off your brain development, which reflects in your IQ.